You're listening to the Maryland Crabs podcast with John Frenay and my dad, Tim Hamilton. Okay, there, I did it. Give me my phone back.
Live from a grungy kitchen table located in Annapolis, Maryland's scenic and historic capital, it's the Maryland Crabs podcast. With each episode, your hosts, Tim Hamilton, John Frenay, and the occasional guest will dive in and pick apart the stuff that really matters most to you. We're too lazy to actually solve any of these problems, but we can definitely stir the pot. From schools, politics, parking in the fire lane, to those horrible people who drive BMWs. And here with this week's episode, live from the kitchen table, Tim Hamilton and John Frenay.
We are here at the Commons again with our Todd Stevens, and I always thought your name was Todd Stevens, but apparently there's an R in front of it.
Oh, I thought you meant it was our, like it's our Todd Stevens. He belongs to us.
Yeah, for the next 40 minutes or so.
It was my mother's idea.
But like a poet, like T.S. Eliot.
Well, you see, the story goes, she liked the ring of Richard Todd Stevens better than Todd Richard Stevens, but she liked the name Todd, so she decided, we'll call you Richard Todd Stevens, but we'll call you Todd when we, call your name. So then when I sign my name, I do R. Todd Stevens.
Well, when she was yelling at you, what did she call you? Like because I'm Timothy Michael Hamilton. When I was in trouble, when you were in trouble, what were you?
Timothy Michael. Oh, I was just Todd.
So she shortened your name when she was mad at you?
Well, it wasn't shortened per se. It was like, that was my name that I always used, was Todd, in school with my parents, other family members. But like some people, I just didn't go by my first name. I went by my middle name.
You look more like a Todd than a Richard.
I guess that's good.
Well. You could pull
and there's a producer that produced Friends, the TV show. At the end, it says produced by Todd Stevens, and everybody in high school thought that was me.
Oh,
you need to capitalize on that. And actually,
I should.
The other Timothy Hamilton is a gay porn star in the Czech Republic. So,
and you did capitalize on that.
Oh,
yeah, I did.
Wow!
Actually, yeah.
Of all things, I mean, that's a documentary right there.
Well, I'll take what I can get. Any notoriety. That's
well, we are here with Todd Stevens, who is the producer, director, writer, creator. Came up with the idea of a new film that's been selling out here locally at the Bowtie Cinemas at Harbor Center. Crownsville Hospital, From Lunacy to Legacy, and that should be a familiar name to everybody that's listening to this. The Crownsville Hospital has been in the news because the Bayhawks want to play lacrosse there, because there's lots of nonprofits that are there that are doing great work, and it's got a really sort of a macabre and kind of a dark history, which is where you come in. Thank you for coming out.
Thank you, John and Tim.
This movie is been around for, I say it's been around, but I mean the concept has been around for years and years and years. And I heard about this probably 3 or 4 years ago, where you were starting to do this. And you're looking just to tell the story of the Crownsville Hospital, right?
Yes, I am, because sure, it's on the internet, but some people haven't read Wikipedia or the other articles, and so. Also, I dug up some things that aren't on the internet that people might want to hear about. And, the state doesn't want anyone really discussing the hospital. The state, it's sort of an embarrassment to the Department of Health and Mental Hygiene in Baltimore because it has such a bad history, a negative history. So they really don't want any discussions to occur about it. They kind of want it swept under the rug.
Well, what is the history of Crownsville Hospital? What was it? When was it? I mean, give us the wiki. Give us the wiki real quick. I mean, it was built as a state hospital for the mentally ill or the insane.
It was a segregated hospital. It was set aside in 1910 to be built, and it started construction in 1911. The first patients moved there in 1911 and lived in a farmhouse, actually. And then the 3 main administration buildings were built from 1911 to 1913. And so what was going on in Baltimore at the time was what the Baltimore Sun referred to as a black invasion. There were a lot of black folk, as they were called, in Baltimore. And it had the third largest black population compared to DC and New York. And so the white people in Baltimore, they said that we want to have a place where the blacks can be housed, the mentally ill blacks, and taken care of because they're in almshouses, they're in jails, and they need proper treatment. But some people have uncovered evidence to the fact that it's the opposite, that it was for racial purposes that they were segregated and put into a separate hospital. We already had Spring Grove Hospital and Springfield Hospital in Baltimore, and those were housing the white patients, and they didn't know exactly what to do with the black folks, so they built their own hospital.
What was the one in D.C.? That was not St. Anne's. It was,
let's see, there's,
They closed that one, too. That
Rosehaven, I think?
No.
And this is though a psych hospital, right? I mean, it's...
Right, exactly.
St. Elizabeth's.
It was a psych hospital.
Yes, St. Elizabeth's,
Yeah.
yes. It was called the Hospital for the Negro Insane of Maryland when it first opened. And then it was desegregated in 1962 when white patients were allowed in. And mainly the staff was white until then, and the patients were black.
Why did they desegregate?
Slowly became
was it
integrated.
just because they needed the facilities?
Well, as I mentioned before, the powers that be decided we cannot have blacks mixed with whites, the mentally ill. We need to segregate them and build them their own hospital so that they're not,
But when they
integrated.
desegregated,
It was a law. It became a law.
Oh, gotcha.
That's part of President John F. Kennedy.
So what has happened here? What was happening that makes the hospital so nefarious that demands a documentary be written about it?
Well,
Or what piqued
John,
your interest, I guess, Todd?
Yes, my interest. I used to live 2 miles from the hospital, and I used to drive past it and see the broken glass and the bars.
Were you a kid at that
on
time?
the windows? No. This was like 10 years ago.
Okay, I was going to say, was that one of those things that like riding past in my Schwinn with the with the banana seat,
My
like,
Schwinn Stingray,
wondering what
my 5-speed Stingray with the gear shift knob. No,
because it just closed in 2004, right?
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly, Tim. 2004 is when it closed. So it was open almost 100 years, 96 years, and so I have a filmmaking background, and I'd made some shorts, and I was looking for something creative. I wanted a big creative project to work on. I'm a manager at NASA, and that job fulfills me, but not totally fulfills me. So I was looking for something creative, a creative project.
I like the guy from NASA who's going, I needed something more than being a director at NASA.
Well, it's a technical position. I manage a technical team. And so my mother...
You excited for tomorrow? Tomorrow's the big black hole thing.
Yes.
We're going to see the black hole tomorrow, John.
Yes, it's
I hear
coming.
that.
First picture ever.
Net neutrality today and a big black hole tomorrow. Coincidence? I think not.
So this is what you do on this. This is what you were kind of doing on the side.
On the side, I was working on the film because my day job wasn't, I guess, as you call it, taking care of my creative needs. And I have a filmmaking background. I have a BA in cinema from a university in Ohio, and that's where I'm from. I'm from Ohio.
Where?
Tiffin, Ohio. Small town in northwestern Ohio.
Okay.
Yeah.
I went to school there for a year.
Okay.
Not in Tiffany, but in Marietta, down in the southeastern corner.
Exactly. Yeah. Where it's rolling. There's lots of rolling hills down there.
And I'm a fan of WKRP in Cincinnati.
Oh,
so,
exactly.
Yeah. So
yes,
that's the
course.
connection between all three of us.
Yes, this is natural.
Right.
So anyway, getting back to the hospital, I volunteer for the Annapolis Film Festival every year since the beginning, and I saw some of the documentaries coming in that were accepted, and I thought, I could probably do something. What could it be? And then it just hit me. It dawned on me, why don't I make a film about the hospital, Crownsville Hospital? It's in my backyard. I thought maybe someone's done it already. I'm sure someone's done it. It's so interesting. I looked on the net. All I could find was there was a nursing student in 2007 that started working on a film, and she'd interviewed some of the same people that I've interviewed, but then she stopped. And there was even an article about her that was written in the Capital Gazette saying, next year she's going to premiere her film. So I found her on LinkedIn, and I contacted her. I said, did you ever finish your film? She said, no. And I said, why not? And she said, funding. She just never got enough funding. And making a film is rather expensive. It was more expensive than I thought it would be. And my film, compared to other films and festivals, is relatively cheap.
Sure.
I mean, they will spend 4 or 5 times the amount that I did on my film, on their films. But all my money was private funding, except for I had a Kickstarter project, and that grossed about $2,800. And that got me started. That got me with a good camera, a drone, and some stills from the Maryland archives, because they charged me $50 a still to use them in my film. And so 10 stills, $500 right there.
Right.
And in the end, I used, I gathered about 1,000 stills. I didn't use all of them, but there you go. They add up. Because if you watch something like the Ted Bundy tapes is a good example. That's on Netflix right now. It's very popular. Just look at all the stills and all the footage,
right?
And the newsroom, examples. There's so much.
So that's not
almost every second is covered with something.
That's not in the public domain. Those stills.
Well, no. So there's a collection.
If you don't make money off of it, it probably is. I mean, if it's used for news purposes, I think.
Well, but if it's in the public domain, it's in the public domain.
Well, see, the Maryland Archives owns the photos.
All right.
There's a whole Crownsville Hospital collection. It's in their special collections, it's called. So you have to get special permission to even look at these photos because they're stored in a room and they have to pull them for you and then they give them to you. And there's quite a lot. But most are from the early days, from the 30s, 40s, 50s. And so some are quite lovely. And also there's restrictions as far as showing people's faces, things like that, if they're patients.
Well, yeah, I guess so. Right?
Yeah.
It's not because they're not in the public. They're not in the public domain. They're not in the public space, so they have an expectation of privacy.
Exactly. HIPAA rules. They don't want to violate any HIPAA rules. And so what the archives at the time did was they would charge you $25 to scan the photos and $25 to use them, to have the rights to use them in your magazine, article, book, or film. So it was $50 a photo. And like I said, that adds up. After a while, I probably spent $3,000 or $4,000 just on stills from them. Wow. From Getty Images, I bought some, and from other sources. So it adds up.
I was just thinking about rentals, like the camera and the AR and all those things. But I guess
I didn't actually rent because my schedule was hard to predict because a lot of the interview subjects basically some canceled or some rescheduled. So I didn't want to have like a camera in hand and have somebody schedule, and then I'd have to pay for the camera. So I bought my own gear over the 5-year period. It took me 5 years to make this film, to finish it. So that was interesting in and of itself because the technology changed. It went from It went from HD.
You've got your Betamax. You got your Betamax, and you're ready.
And now it's 6K. Yeah. So it kept increasing. So some of the early interviews I did with just a low-end Pentax still camera that shot 1080p HD video. And then at the end, I was shooting with a Blackmagic 4K camera. So some of the interviews, are a little grainy, and some are crisp and clear.
You mentioned you're talking about the subjects that you've spoken with in the film and everything else. Is that something that, I'm presuming that there are no patients that were there that are available to speak to. So you're speaking with the family members or historians, or who did you speak with in the film?
That's a good question, John. So in the beginning, I really didn't expect any patients to come forward. And I didn't think I needed any. And in fact, originally, I just was going to do a short. I was going to do like a 1-hour documentary. And it wasn't until I started investigating the hospital and researching it that I realized this is too complex of a place. It needs to be longer. And in fact, my first cut of the film was 4.5 hours long. So I had to cut that down to 3, and then eventually to 108 minutes, which is what I call the festival version. But again, today, that is still a little heavy because most documentaries in festivals are 70, 80 minutes.
Right.
That's what everyone's shooting for now because people have such a short attention span.
You got to get it down to like a 6-minute clip on. What's the Twitter?
Vimeo?
No, not Vimeo.
That's
I can't remember what it was called.
That was 6 seconds.
Yeah, it was
15 seconds.
It was 6 seconds or something like that. But
it's just I couldn't cut it down any further. I was working with a documentary coach, and she was coaching me on what to use, what not to use, and she kept saying 100 minutes, but it's 108. That's close enough. But still, if you cut it too much, it loses its power and impact. It really does. This type of film.
I'd have to agree with that. But so who did we talk to?
We talked to a lady whose mother was at the hospital. I talked to a lot of people that worked at the hospital, some nurses, psychologists. I talked to 2 former superintendents. I did talk to 4 former patients. Some patients that came forward, a lot of people came forward on Facebook, either during the production of the film or after it was finished, and would tell me these wonderful stories. And when I asked them to sit down with me, they got cold feet. One lady I recall said, well, my husband knows I was a patient at Crownsville, but my children don't know. So I really don't want them to know.
Okay.
So I had some people were reticent also because of fear. They had signed contracts with the state saying that they wouldn't divulge any information about Crownsville.
Wait a minute. Okay, so I am a patient. Now, this is not a criminal psych hospital. Okay, this isn't. These are just people that have been deemed. Perhaps they may harm themselves, but I mean, this is not.
It did house the criminally insane. It did. There was a building to the right of the administration building called the C building, and that's where they housed the criminally insane. Okay. So if you had broken the law and were deemed insane.
Well, I mean, right now we're going through with the Annapolis, the guy that shot up the Annapolis Capitol newsroom. He's debating whether he wants to plead criminally not responsible. I mean, if he successfully pleads that and they find that he wasn't criminally responsible, he goes, I think it's out into Jessup, where they now have a state hospital for those types. So the criminally insane were also housed on Crownsville as well?
Yes, so he would go to Crownsville if Crownsville was still open. Yeah.
Now, and you mentioned this, and this blows my mind. So I'm all of a sudden I'm at Crownsville, and I've been deemed cured or okay.
I hope you're not at Crownsville.
To leave out, and the superintendent says, okay, here's your stuff. I mean, I'm assuming it's like leaving, like if you're in prison, like here's the stuff that you checked in with. Have a good life. Oh, by the way,
well, it depends. You know, John, what's interesting is one of the reasons this film was 4.5 hours in the first cut was because this hospital changed faces, let's say, over the centuries. So it was one type of hospital run a certain way in the 20s in the early days, and then in the 50s it was overcrowded. So it was built for like 1,200 patients, and it had double that. It had 2,500 in its heyday in '55. So and then in the 80s we had some reformation that took place. And so it just kept changing and evolving, this hospital. So it just depends on when you were there. There was a time when you would go there and you would be given clothes to wear. You would be given like an outfit.
But when you leave, though, they're giving them a piece of paper saying, "Here you go, but don't let anybody know what happened here."
No, I think no.
So the workers, some of the workers that worked at Crownsville Hospital, were made to sign a contract, and I was told this by a former person that was a minister at Crownsville Hospital. He said, "I'm hesitant to speak with you on camera because I signed a document that says I will not talk about Crownsville Hospital with the press, the quote press, and so I guess I can be considered the press."
Now we're all about.
I mean, it just depends on how you look at it. Yeah, am I media? I mean, I guess, but I'm not really the press. I'm not going to write an article, but I am making a film. So he was scared he was going to lose his job, but he did say, I'm going to go into retirement soon, so maybe it's okay. It won't matter by the time the film comes out. So in the end, he did sit down with me, and I was very happy. And he had some nice comments, and I used them in the film.
What was life at Crownsville like for a patient? And I know you said that it changed throughout the years as to what it was, but it's a huge property. It's like 600 acres, I think, or...
It keeps dwindling. In the early days, it was roughly 1,500 acres. Now it's about 500, and that's only because the Scenic River Land Trust and the state, they got together and they quarantined off. Yeah, they quarantined off that whole area called Bacon Ridge, and that's about 1,000 acres. So that's all protected land now that no one can build on. But
I mean, were people just wandering around? And I mean, you look at the stereotypical psych hospitals that are portrayed in any type of a movie, and they're out there in their little white suits, or in the chairs playing chess and just sort of wandering around these lush grounds and everything else. I mean, was that what was happening at Crownsville?
Yes, at times. I was told that some of the patients were given privileges, and you had to maybe earn those. So yeah, if you weren't harmful to yourself or others, you're allowed to walk the grounds, and you'd have more freedom than, let's say, other patients. It just depends on why you were there and what kind of mental illness that you had.
Right.
Yeah, and a lot of them were admitted voluntarily.
That's true.
So. I mean, in any psychiatric facility, I think the vast majority are voluntary admissions as opposed to
what do you mean
the
by voluntary
5150.
admission? Is that like that we've had a meeting, like, okay, we're having a meeting here today, and
Britney Spears just checked herself in
a little bit.
Yeah, sort of like rehab. I mean, I have a patient that I interviewed, and he's coming to the premiere actually, and he said that there was a time when he admitted himself because he didn't feel comfortable. It just depends on how you feel. I mean, another time he blacked out, and he was admitted. The state troopers came, I guess, and escorted him to Crownsville Hospital. So,
think about One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest when it dawns on McMurphy that all his friends there are all voluntary, right. And he's aghast that he's the only one there that's there involuntarily. And in the 1940s and 50s, there was a boom. I don't want to use the word, but with the psychiatric facilities that they were building them upstate New York was an area.
You had the World War II. All the soldiers were coming back, so we had PTSD,
shell shock.
Exactly, back then, and then
they didn't know what to do with it.
Yeah, there was one thing that's very interesting that he wouldn't allow an interview. He wanted to interview with me, but his quote elder, as they're called, wouldn't permit it. An Amish person who worked there in the 1950s, and he did it to escape, I guess, the draft in the Korean War. He didn't want to have to go to war, and so that was a very interesting story. But again, he said he could not, sit down and speak with me on camera.
What's the lunacy part of it? I mean, I guess we get the mentally thing, but what I've heard about testing and experiments and stuff like this. I mean, this borderlines on what we saw, in some of the concentration camps. I mean, the mystery behind it.
Sure. Well,
and is this a thing? Was this happening here? I mean,
yeah, sure. Yeah, so that's why I put lunacy in the name, is because that's what mentally ill patients were referred to in the early days.
Lunatics, right?
Lunatics, yeah.
And it's an asylum.
Yeah,
because they thought that they were affected by the moon.
Exactly. Very good, Tim.
I know. I'm a liberal arts major.
I mean, were they doing experiments?
Yes. Yes. So I have people that have informed me that the pharmaceutical companies were performing experiments on the patients, either with or without their knowledge in the early days. And also, you can read on Wikipedia, they were, in the early days in the 30s, they were injected with malaria. And their brains were drilled into. They drilled into their skulls, which was, I mean, it sounds horrible, but it was, according to the Times, it was a way to better X-ray the skull, the brain.
Okay.
If you drilled into the skull and then filled it with helium, you get a clearer picture of the brain. So that was done to some of the patients, but it left them with nausea and headaches for months on end after that, and it was probably quite painful too at the time that they received the drillings. So. Yeah, things like that we just, today we consider barbaric. We would not do that. In fact, straitjackets have been outlawed, but there was a time that they were used at Crownsville. Shock therapy was used. Lobotomies were performed.
Hydrotherapy, forced sterilizations.
Sure, yes.
Whenever you think about the asylum situation, I mean, and the movies are filled with them. You think, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest is a great example. There was all at a time where this experimentation was happening, and it wasn't... Yes. It wasn't that kind of, Mengele type experimentation. It was maybe the ethics we look at now and kind of question, but they thought they were making a difference.
Right, at the time. And I also want to make a point, because people forget sometimes, and also I'm reminded by my Facebook fans that, and most of them are people that worked at the hospital, that these things occurred at other mental hospitals around the U.S. It wasn't just...
It wasn't
in
this
Crownsville.
One nefarious hospital.
Yes, it wasn't that Crownsville only did this, and Crownsville, was horrific. But a lot of the mental hospitals were practicing the same methods at the same time. Yeah, just to be fair.
Do you believe in ghosts?
I do. I believe in the supernatural. I don't let it give me anxiety or control my life. But that's a part that I could have explored more further in my film, but I just didn't have the time, because I have spoken with people that have seen things at the hospital. Some of the guards that work there now have seen visions, like Here's an example. One guard said she saw like a woman dressed in white in the snow, and another guard said she saw a figure of a lady in the window. I have a man who sent me a photograph of a hallway in Crownsville Hospital that he took, and there's a door at the end of the hallway that's slightly open, and there's a woman, like her face and the face of her daughter, and they're kind of blurry, and they're very spooky looking, and he said those are spirits. Things like that.
Did you happen to speak with Taylor Piles?
No.
He's got the Blue Ribbon Project, and that's housed over there as well. And he's got a video of something weird happening. I can't remember exactly what it was, but he's got like a classroom set up, and there was something moving that had no real reason to be moving.
I mean, I could have added another 30 minutes to the film by covering that aspect, because one of the fellows I interviewed also said that he was a maintenance worker, and he was in a building at night, and he'd set his wrench down right next to him, and a minute later he went to reach for it, and it had slid magically across the room,
out of reach,
like 10 feet away. And he said he wasn't drinking or on drugs, and yes, it was like 11, 12 around, at night, but he said he doesn't know how that wrench moved. And so, you think about it, there's a lot of spirits there. There's a lot of angry spirits, because a lot of the patients in the early days were abused. They were tortured, raped, murdered. So you've got some angry spirits that probably want to hang around and haunt us.
Right.
They're upset.
I'll buy it.
I'm a skeptic.
The graveyard there. There is a graveyard.
There is.
And I know that you mentioned Scenic Liver. I do this all the time. It's not Scenic Livers Land Trust. It's the Scenic Rivers Land Trust.
How's that beer?
Yeah.
Scenic liver.
That is a
My
tongue
liver
twister.
is scenic, I will tell you.
I just talked to the Scenic Rivers Land Trust about a week ago, and that is just a mental block that I've got, as far as I constantly refer to it as the Livers Land Trust. So I think we need to change the name. But they're doing their Walk for the Woods, and they have a Say Your Name ceremony. And I think Janice Hayes Williams is an historian that leads that there. And so that's how I sort of knew that there was a graveyard there. What's the story on the graveyard? Is that just people that had died there that were never claimed by family? Exactly.
You answered your own question.
Okay.
No, but just to further speak about that, so Janice is in my film. She was one of the first people I interviewed. She was recommended to me. And so the story goes, she and her uncle and her daughter went to the Maryland archives, and their goal was to match up death certificates with those graves. The graves you see are numbered. There are some that have names, but most have numbers. She wanted to try to figure out what was the cause of death for a lot of the graves, and how many there were. So apparently there's different figures. There's 1,500, 16, 18. We can go with 18, the largest. Supposedly there are 1,800 people buried there. And yes, it was just like you said, patients that the families, they either didn't have families, or the families didn't have enough money to give them a proper burial. So they were buried in this cemetery, it's about a mile from the hospital. So it's a good hike. And I've heard that there are also bodies buried around the hospital buildings too, that sometimes in the winter they didn't take the effort to haul the bodies off to the cemetery, and they just buried them in back.
Wow.
Yeah.
Puts a whole lot of questions and problems if you're looking to redevelop.
Yeah, and the morgue is in the woods. Like, there's a small white building in the woods behind the administration building, and it's where they used to, prepare the bodies, and examine the bodies after they were deceased. It's on the way to the cemetery.
Mm-hmm. Tell you what, let's take a little bit of a break, and we'll come right back with our Todd Stevens, who is Crownsville Hospital from Lunacy to Legacy, which you will be able to see in theaters here and there. And we'll talk about a little bit more about the movie. This is fascinating to me.
Not your Todd, but our Todd.
Yes. Everyone's Todd.
This is Sarah Koenig, host of the Serial Podcast. I'm coming to Annapolis, to Maryland Hall, on Friday, May 17th, for an onstage conversation about how we created Serial, how we make stories, well, how we make them good, and why they matter. I hope you'll come. For tickets, go to marylandhall.org.
Of all the ways our customers can describe us, nothing means more than being their favorite.
Zachary's is the gold standard in customer service.
This is the absolute best jewelry buying experience of my life.
The annual holiday party for their customers is beyond a memorable experience.
They have the most exquisite jewelry, and the store atmosphere, it's the best around.
They listen, and there's never any pressure to buy.
We've purchased fine jewelry from different big names in the Baltimore area, but we were treated like family at Zachary's.
You'll not find a nicer group of people. They have my business for life.
Best in Annapolis is simply not enough.
Zachary's has been a part of many of my life's best memories.
After it's all said and done, there's one jewelry store that's my absolute favorite.
Zachary's. Online at zacharysjewelers.com. More than a jewelry store, a jeweler.
All right, we're back again with Todd Stevens, who is the producer and director of Crownsville Hospital, From Lunacy to Legacy. You were so kind to give me this little shrink-wrap DVD, and I'm excited to see the film because I've not been able to. I've tried to buy tickets in the theaters locally when the few screenings that you've had, and you've created a little bit of a buzz and a demand for it because I get in there and I click buy, and it says, yeah, shit out of luck. Try again.
SOL.
So I'm very excited to see this. But where can we see the film up? And I'm looking at the cover, and you've got a lot of little film awards too, with the little what are those called? They're
called laurels.
Laurels.
Festival laurels.
Don't rest on them. My dad always told me.
Okay, I won't. So it's been having a really successful run. I've actually finished the film last May, so May of 2018, and my intent was to give it a 1-year festival run before releasing it on demand. So in May, next month, it's going to be on Vimeo on demand, Amazon Prime, and iTunes. And then I just signed a contract with a company in Los Angeles, a distribution company, that will put it on other video on demand sources. But as far as the festivals, it's been in over 35 festivals in the U.S. and internationally, and won over 14 awards, mostly Best Director, Best Documentary. I even won one in Texas at a festival a couple months ago for Best Writing, of all things. And there's no writing in my film because it's interviews, but I guess it was because I did a good job editing them together.
Well, yeah, but I mean, so when you have this much information and this much of a story of 96 years, and all the people who worked there, and the people who were committed, and the people who were voluntarily committed, and all the different aspects of the African American experience and the past, and even veterans, how do you even begin to craft a narrative with that? I mean, that to me, you said that you had to winnow it down to 108 minutes. Yeah. That to me is staggering, because
it was.
How can you cut back on that story? Like you say, all right, what story do I want to tell? And you go one of many, many different directions.
Right. I mean, that's hard to answer because it depends on the person. It's very individual. So there are many reasons to make a film. Sometimes some outweigh others. Whether it's for you, they say, make your film for you. Or for an audience, make it for an audience. I sort of did a little bit of both. But what I did is I asked myself, if I saw this film or a film like it on a festival program, what kind of things would I want to see in this film? What kind of things interest me about a mental hospital? So I'll give you an example. One section of the film is all about escapes, because a lot of the patients tried to escape. Whether they tried to escape because they didn't want to be there, or because they didn't know any better. Yeah. So I just tried to put in the film what I thought would interest not only me but other people. And it was very hard, like you said. I mean, I could have easily a 6-hour miniseries on PBS. I haven't pitched that to them yet, but I have enough material. I mean, think about it. I interviewed over 50 people. Each person talked for approximately 2 hours. So I have like 100 hours of interviews.
Wow.
That I had to go through. I had to listen to each interview, and that's why this took 5 years to make, because it took like a whole year just to interview everybody, and then another year to listen to them, and then another year to edit. So it just took a while to compile it and to figure out what subjects to pick. I thought, okay, I have to make this film and make it in sections so it's not too confusing. And there's a number of ways you could do it chronologically, which I sort of did. I threw that in. I didn't have a timeline. Some people would have had like an animated timeline, like in the Ted Bundy tapes, he's got a nice timeline. So whenever he's talking about a Ted Bundy episode, he shows the timeline and the year and the month even, and the date sometimes that this incident occurred in Ted Bundy's life. But in this film, I go chronologically anyway, so it's kind of, you can sort of tell without me making it literal. And I could have gone hog wild and put all kinds of stuff in there like the supernatural, but I really didn't. I had a list of questions that I asked all my subjects, and I did not ask them about the supernatural. Some people brought that up, but it wasn't like a big topic for me. It's not something, sure, it's something maybe I want to hear about, but I didn't want to use any screen time for that because there were other things just, like escapes that I thought were more important than the supernatural.
What got you into making, what did you wake up one morning and just say, I think I want to make a movie? Or, have you always, I'm assuming this is your first movie?
First feature film. I've made some commercials and shorts and even like an educational video in the past, and I wanted to make a feature film. I wanted to make something big, and I also have an idea for a great narrative feature film that I'm going to work on soon. So I wanted a good subject, and there's a lot of subjects out there, and everyone's making movies now. When you go to the festivals, there's a ton of documentaries now, and they're done so creatively. It's not just talking heads like it used to be. Remember the documentaries from the 60s and 70s, talking heads with some filler? Now they're so interesting the way they're put together, and the pace is so much faster, and they have so much material. I just heard that Prince, they're going to make a documentary about Prince, and the director has been given access to all the Prince footage and the Prince stills and information, memorabilia, everything. So that's like a goldmine for a director to have access.
Well, there's so many different ways to do a documentary that you look at some of them, the way the method that they're used, and you think, well, that's kind of a device. I think, for example, Hoop Dreams. You could have done a documentary that was just about the collegiate athletics experience. What it's like to, for all these students, and what they did is they followed one on his quest to become a collegiate athlete, and he kind of represented all of them. So they only had to concentrate on the one story, but that represented hundreds of thousands of other stories. Yeah. So bearing that in mind, were there any stories that jumped out you from either the people who were committed or the employees who were there that you just kind of walked away going, wow, that was just amazing how many people had that same experience? Yeah, sure.
Each person's experience is a little different, and they were there at different times in their lives. I interviewed a fellow, he was there when he was a child. He was between ages 5 and 8. And then I interviewed somebody who was there when he was in his late teens, early 20s. And then, the reasons they were there. The one fellow was there because his mother was a drug addict, and so was his father. So social services came and realized that they had issues and that he had been abused. And so they had to put him somewhere, and they put him in Crownsville Hospital of all places. And then the other fellow had... he was a runaway. He had ADHD. He had a family, but he was sort of a troublemaker, and they just needed to put him someplace. So, it didn't take much in those days to get committed.
It was a catch-all.
Yeah, a lot of different types of people that maybe shouldn't have been at Crownsville were admitted to Crownsville.
Yeah, if you're a criminal, you went to prison or at least jail. If you didn't fall inside that box, you're knocking on the door of Crownsville at 3 a.m. saying, we got one for you.
Yeah, and I heard that back in the day, people would threaten their children and say, if you don't behave, you're going to Crownsville. That was like the big joke. But because it was that easy.
They did an experiment relatively recently. I want to say it was probably about 15, 20 years ago. And it's one of two famous experiments. One is the prison experiment, the Stanford prison experiment.
Yes.
Which turns out that was all bunk.
I want to see that film.
Yeah.
Yes.
But the second of which was that they took some psychiatric students, and I want to say it was Berkeley or what have you. It's probably about 20 years ago. And they had them admitted to various hospitals to chart what the process was and what it was like. And I think 90% of these students, and they pre-screened them all as well, gave them psych screenings, and 90% of them were all diagnosed with some form of schizophrenia or some form of mental disorder. And that the demonstration was what happens when you go into one of these facilities, and this wasn't that long ago, this was 20 years ago, that you are, the assumption is made and you backwards engineer from there. And you figure in the 40s, 50s, 60s that it was just, and they didn't have the working knowledge of the psychiatric practices that we do now, and even now it's still a mystery.
And the drugs back then, Thorazine was used extensively in the 50s. It was formulated, so 50s and 60s, 50s, 60s, 70s, it was given for all kinds of treatments, and it made people like zombies. So they just they didn't function at all, because a lot of times it was easier to treat somebody if they were drugged up. They weren't going to try to escape. They weren't going to cause a scene.
It was easy.
Yeah.
It was easy.
So also, now we have all these levels of diagnoses for people. Back then, there were much fewer names for psychoses, and so there were less drugs and less diagnoses.
But even now, I'd like to say this, like if we were talking about dentistry or anything else, we can say, God, the leaps and bounds we've made, and there's probably psychiatrists and psychologists who are listening right now are pulling their hair out going, we've made huge leaps. But I mean, we still don't know why SSRIs work.
True. I mean, like I know, here's an example. I know a young lady who has been diagnosed as being, having depression. So she was prescribed Prozac. Well, now they're saying, you may also have ADHD mixed in with the depression, so we might give you Wellbutrin, because that will hopefully take care of both ADHD and depression. So it's interesting how we've narrowed it down to a drug that can handle both. And it's just, back in the 50s, we would just prescribe Thorazine probably.
Yeah, I mean, I'd be interested to see what the percentage of people who were diagnosed with psychiatric disorders back then compared to now. Although it just seems that right now, I think we're kind of at a cusp when you look at depression and anxiety, obsessive compulsive disorders, and mental health in general. I think the stigma's still there, but I think we're starting to lift it somewhat, and we're starting to make explorations into alternative methods of handling this. But you're not seeing, I don't think you see these large-scale institutions that you did at that time. I think it's more outpatient, I think, for the most part. Not for the most part, but I mean, the more significantly, because I think you do have those specific diagnoses like you're talking about, where you're not just throwing everybody into a building and, having just, one psychiatrist per 100 patients.
Right, and that, one of the sections of my film toward the end is about the closing of Crownsville. Why did it close? And so, economics was one reason, and, they didn't just have, they didn't have as many patients. They had about 200 patients in the end when they closed, and beds. So,
and is that? Do you think that's a reason because of the advancements in
the programs,
medical treatment? And
as Tim said, in the outpatient programs. So you have better drugs now that can pinpoint mental illnesses, and then you have families that are more responsible, I guess you would say, that, back in the day, some people didn't know how to handle epilepsy, as an example, and so they would send their children with epilepsy to Crownsville, and that's where you would go. Now, we have other ways of treating it, but back then, in the 20s, 30s, you would go to a mental hospital.
How long do you have any idea how long the longest term at Crownsville was? I mean,
there were some lifers there. I don't know. That's a good question. A lot of the patient files were lost or destroyed. So, same with there was a ledger, I guess, that it had the names of the people, and it matched the names of the people with the tombstones, which aren't really tombstones. They're just like these bricks. I've been to the cemetery, and there's just these bricks, and they're not even standing upright. They're laying on the ground, because supposedly the state said it's easier to mow the grass back there in the graveyard if they're laying down, which I guess it would be. But so they've laid them all down flat, and there was a book that matched the graves up with the people's names, but At some point in the late 50s, early 60s, it disappeared.
That's sad.
So it could be reasonable that somebody could come in there at 12, 13, 14
and stay their life. Yeah, the rest of their life. They could stay the rest of their life there, depending on what kind of illness they had. And they had whole buildings set aside for seniors, for the elderly, and treatment programs for those folks. So there was all kinds. There was children that were at Crownsville, criminals, elderly.
How did the care differ for African American patients versus white patients, or in similar institutions? Was the care any better, or was it any worse? Was it?
Yeah, well, I just want to be careful how I answer that. I mean, they were mistreated and abused, the black patients, more so than the white patients. And that's a fact. I mean, there's been articles written about that.
I mean,
there was racism. There was racism, pretty much, against the black mentally ill patients. I mean, there's a lot that were raped and taken advantage of, because so if you're a black woman in a mental hospital, you were against an orderly or a worker, so they're going to win out over you if it's brought to someone's attention.
I don't think that's any different in any kind of incarceration, whether it be penal at this point. It's going to be your word against the guard. Who are they going to take, unless it gets to a point where it gets out into court or something like that? But
you mentioned Janice Hayes Williams. She told me in my film that in the early days that black people were considered just one level above animals as far as experimentation goes. So that's the way they were looked at, and it's so sad. And so when you ask the question about treatment, if you look at blacks that way and you're a white person, then of course you're going to treat them differently.
There's something terrifying about a mental institution. It's been the backdrop for so many movies, like American Horror Story, and I think what's terrifying about it is if you're going to prison, you did something on some level, and you're in prison, and that is your life, and that no one doubts you should be there, and there's not that protection. I mean, there should be, but there's not that protection for you from society. They're saying, well, you're a bad person, you're going to prison, you get what you deserve.
Punished. Yeah.
If you are mentally ill and you are in a mental institution, and I'm talking about like in the 40s and 50s, is the terrifying part is, let's say that you didn't belong there. That let's say that you had all your faculties, that you wouldn't be institutionalized today. Because it's something that you take, Wellbutrin, and you're better. Yeah. But the terror of being kept somewhere with people who are not in their right minds, and you're in danger, and there's the stereotypical orderlies who are abusive, and you're not supposed to be there. That's the terrifying thing, is how can you end up? You could be a perfectly sane person and end up in an institution.
Yeah, you could, and a lot of people did. And one of the fellows I interviewed who was in Crownsville said, you have also the people that think they shouldn't be, but should be. And so, who's to say about this person? Because I met him, 2 years ago. I don't know what he was like in the 70s when he was at Crownsville, but he told me his dad, committed him to Crownsville, that he didn't want to go, but his dad committed him, and they drugged him up right away, and he tried to escape 4 times, and he did.
It's not like you're doing anything criminal, because you're saying
he didn't want to be there. Yeah, he didn't feel that he needed to be there, and that he was a problem to society. So he got out 4 times, but they always brought him back.
It reminds me of the Magdalene houses in Ireland right up to the late 80s. They had these houses for incorrigible girls. There's girls who flirted with boys, or who were pregnant, or whose parents thought that they weren't Catholic enough, and they'd put them in these hellish workhouses that were run by the Magdalene nuns, and they just closed them down in the late 80s. There was a great movie written about that, but that's something that's terrifying to the normal person, is being normal out in society with your freedom, and all of a sudden you're put in a place that where your basic freedoms are gone, and you want to get out, and like, nope, you're not getting out.
Sure. I mean, the hospital is very creepy. If you drive past it and you look at the buildings, it has this very sad look to it. And this aura about it that affected me. I get emotional every time I drive past it. So I just sort of had to make a film about it. And when I saw no one else had, I tackled it. But now looking back, I kind of know why no one tackled it, because it is so difficult and complex to pick out. What do I say in this film? Who do I interview?
You had to feel guilty because you left so much out by necessity.
I did.
Like so many valuable stories, and
I sort of. I mean, I have a director's cut, as I call it, Blu-ray that it's for sale, and it's got some scenes that aren't in the original Blu-ray that I just didn't have time for, but they're on the director's cut. So some extras there. I mean, there was a whole therapy program. They had music therapists, dance therapists, recreational therapists, music therapists, and that was like a 20-minute section that I interviewed folks for, and they played their instruments for me. That was going to be in the film, but I had to cut that out. But it's in the director's cut DVD.
The proverbial cutting room floor.
Yeah, exactly.
Do you go to all the festivals that I'm looking at all the locals?
I do.
There?
I mean, so in the USA, it's shown in Texas, Oklahoma, California. It's showing at the end of this month, at the end of April, in Laguna, California. The same month, it's showing in Muskogee, Oklahoma, and it's showing at the Richmond Film Festival in Virginia. I try to hit them all that are local in the U.S. It showed recently in London. I couldn't make it to that. I couldn't find my passport in time. I wanted to go. It's shown in Moscow, Croatia, Calcutta, India, of all places. Wow. So it's nice that it's being picked up internationally as well, that the international festivals are interested. Now, some, like the Italian festivals, need your film subtitled, and my film does not have subtitles. That would just be another expense.
That's good. I'm glad. I hate subtitles.
It would be like another expense to add onto the film, and I'd rather put that money towards my next documentaries, that I'm already working on. Yeah, I'm working on one called Scan, which is about Dennis Oppenheim, the conceptual New York City artist who is now deceased, but he had a very interesting sculpture that he tried to build several times in the 80s called Scan, and it was a very interesting piece, but he had so many hardships trying to put it together. And then I have ideas for many more documentaries. I might do a quick one this summer with an idea that I have about a diner that's about 2 hours from here. So, I mean, it gets your creative juices flowing. When you make one documentary...
No, wait, hold on. I love diners. We gotta go back to this.
Yeah, I mean, when you make one documentary, what are you left with? You're left with all this equipment if you didn't rent. So you have all this equipment. You have the knowledge now of how to make a documentary. I mean, there's so many steps to making a documentary, you wouldn't believe it. There's hundreds of steps you have to go through. And then, I had a local musician compose the music for the Crownsville film, graciously, for free.
Who was that?
I had a lot of people. Adrian Bond.
Okay.
He composed the music. I had a lot of people that helped me for free. They volunteered. And so, so you make connections, and so therefore you would think your next documentary would be a lot easier because you know what to do, where to go, and you have the equipment. So yeah, it's like you can't stop me now.
I'd say procedurally, I mean, working the cameras and knowing what process you need to do is probably fairly easy, but I mean, putting it all together is starting from scratch again.
True. I mean, it all starts with an idea, and then it expands, and then it also helps to discuss that idea with other people. I did a lot of the work on the Crownsville film myself. I did the camera, I interviewed people, I edited it, and I produced it. So, yes, my name is in the credits, but so are other people's because it was a group effort. I had other people help me. But I think I'll make my next film more of a group effort because it really does help a lot when you get other people's input. This one, I had sort of like tunnel vision. I was a little selfish, you might want to say, because I had a vision of what I wanted my film to look like and feel like, and this was the story about Crownsville that I wanted to tell. So yeah, I just want to make that clear too. It's like this is my version of Crownsville Hospital. So it's not maybe going to appeal to a certain person that is looking for a certain film. It's for people that might be interested in hearing about what I'm interested in.
It is, and it's funny you talk about the place had a visceral reaction to you.
Yes.
And there are some places that do that. The Holocaust Museum, for me, sometimes I've gone through there in D.C., and literally my chest feels tight. And in certain places and so on and so forth. Well, I'll tell you, if anybody wants to learn more about the film, you've come up with the smallest URL name I've ever possibly imagined. It's called Crownsville Hospital from Lunacy to Legacy.com.
It's the film. It's the name of the film. You can go to the website. You can read up on the film, see some stills, some videos, some trailers. I have Blu-rays for sale, coffee mugs, T-shirts, posters, Stress Brain.
Yeah, we have one right here.
I got the stress brain here. I've been playing with it.
John's squeezing his brain. Yeah.
And so it's showing this Saturday to a sold-out audience at Annapolis Mall, Bowtie Cinemas. And then it's showing again in May 18. That's sold out. That's sold out within 10 hours. And then the June 8th showing, same location, Annapolis Mall, Bowtie Cinemas, sold out in 10 hours. So I had no idea that the local community was so itching to see this film. So I'll probably have another showing in October around Halloween. I think would be perfect.
Okay.
Because I've already gotten, as each showing it gets sold out, I have people that text me, email me, and message me saying, it's a shame. I wanted to get tickets and I just couldn't. Are you going to have another showing? So, when there's enough messages like that, then I'll just have another showing. One lady bought 10 tickets for, I think it was the first showing, the one that's this Saturday. So,
well, I am looking forward to seeing it. I'm going to crack open the Blu-ray here, or the DVD Blu-ray, and check out Crownsville Hospital from Lunacy to Legacy, because the hospital is notorious and it's curious. It's a curiosity for me when I go to the fairgrounds or when I go to the Ren Fest. You go back, you sort of peek over your shoulder and see what's in there. You've heard the stories, and I think this is incredible that Todd Stevens is sort of bringing them to life with his Maryland State Archives and his, all the still pictures and the interviews with you have. And not an easy thing to do, as Tim was talking about, putting it all together and getting down from what did you say you had, something like 4 hours initially, and
4.5 hours the first cut, and so part of whittling it down was you have to have a message. What's the message? So you listen to an interview. Does what this person say fit with your message? And if it doesn't, you just cut it out. But it's tough. It's really hard. Like I said, I work with a documentary coach, and this lady told me to cut some things that I didn't agree with. So I put them back in later because it's a lot of information. So don't watch the film if you're sleepy and tired, or if you've been drinking. I would recommend watching it at night when it's spooky out, when the wind is blowing, because you'll get the full effect that way.
Fantastic. Crownsville Hospital from Lunacy to Legacy. Todd Stevens, who is local here. I mean, by the way, we didn't bring you in from Bollywood or Bollywood or Hollywood. You're right here in Anne Arundel County. Todd Stevens, thank you very much.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Tim.
Thanks for coming in.
You're welcome.
This has been the Maryland Crabs Podcast with Tim Hamilton and John Fernay. Sure to follow them at all the regular places: Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and online at themarylandcrabs.com. Take a moment to rate us on iTunes. Now, get the hell out of my kitchen. Seriously, go!
You're still here? It's over. Go home. Go.